Welcome, everyone. We're so happy to know that you're all here with us. I'm Moji Anderson of UE, and I'm speaking on behalf of myself and my co-editor, Erin McLeod of Vanier College in Montreal, Canada. So we're here celebrating the launch of Beyond Homophobia, Centering LGBTQ Experiences in the Anglophone Caribbean, published by the UE Press, whose team has made this book launch possible. As I mentioned the press, we want to make special mention of the chair of UE Press, Dr. Luce Longsworth, who's sorry she couldn't be here with us today, but who wanted to pass on both her congratulations to us, the editors and the authors and the press, for producing this very relevant title, and her best wishes for a successful event. And we also want to acknowledge and welcome the UE Press's board members who are here with us today. And of course, we welcome all the authors who contributed to the edited volume who are here with us in the Zoom room. So I'm going to say a few things about this book, and then I'm going to hand over to our moderator, Professor Wesley Chrislow, to guide us through a panel discussion with some of our contributors, after which there'll be a Q&A that everyone can participate in. So what we want to do now is give you an idea of the genesis of the book. It all started with a symposium we had in 2015 from a suggestion from Javian Nelson of JFLAG. His organization had a report whose results he wanted to disseminate, and he approached what at the time was ICS, Institute of Caribbean Studies, here at UE, about having an event to do that. So that got Erin thinking about the possibility of bringing other speakers in to have an actual symposium, an event focusing on LGBTQ issues in a way that wasn't just considering LGBTQ people as victims of a hegemonic homophobia, but as actual agents of their own destiny, who had the ability, granted under difficult circumstances, to make a life for themselves here, and not one of unrelenting fear and sadness. It took us no time at all to find all the researchers on LGBTQ issues, and a symposium was born called Beyond Homophobia, Exploring Identities and Sexualities in Jamaica. In it, we explored how, and I'm quoting ourselves, Jamaican sexualities, gender identities, and queer practices are expressed and experienced beyond the discourse of violence and stereotypes, assumptions, and limitations presented by heterosexual and binary gender norms. In addition to JFLAG's report on the lived realities of members of the Jamaican LGBTQ community, we had research on the queerness of the Jamaican dance hall, the treatment of homosexuality in Jamaican newspaper cartoons, and the homoeroticism in nationalist Jamaican art. And it was such a success that Erin and I decided that we could go bigger. We could have an international conference. So we did in 2017. We called it Beyond Homophobia, Centering LGBT Experiences in the Caribbean. We said that we wanted to focus on, and again, quoting ourselves, focus on the lived realities and diverse ways in which LGBT people in the Caribbean experience love, respect, tolerance, intolerance, and acceptance. We wanted to make sure that it wasn't a strictly academic conference, so we tried to attract activists, artists, and artists as well, because we wanted to have relevance beyond academia. And we ended up with a whole bunch of people, not just from here, but from the UK, from the US, Canada, the Netherlands, and various other parts of the Caribbean. UE administration was extremely supportive, with the Dean of the Faculty of Social Sciences at the time, Professor Ian Boxill, and the Principal, Archibald MacDonald, pledging their full support for the initiative. So we had people talking about queerness in Jamaican literature, about how to do research in LGBTQ communities, queerness in Caribbean music, homophobia in the education sector, how to think through and around homophobia, how to move forward as activists, homosexuality and the law, a workshop on trans issues, and also prose, fiction, and a photo exhibition around queer identity. There was a lot. And there was more. Really importantly, there was also a lot of love. Together, we created a space of openness, communion, community, and purpose. There was too much quality in the presentations to let them just stay where they were. So Erin and I made another decision to make some of the papers from that conference and the symposium into a book. Interested authors worked on their papers, and the volume you're about to hear about in more detail was born. So we have to give a big thank you to Professor Wesley Chrislow for agreeing to be the moderator of the discussion we're about to have. He responded very quickly and very enthusiastically to our invitation, and we are very happy to have him. But before we let him take over, let's just tell you a little bit about him. So Dr. Wesley Chrislow is a professor of criminology, chair of the President's University's Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Task Force, director for youth transitioning from care to university, and the first past associate dean of equity at Ontario Tech University. He's worked with the Public Health Agency of Canada and Canadian Institutes of Health Research on mental health among Black Canadians and health inequalities among sexual and gender minorities. In 2003, he published the first Black Canadian gay scholarly text, Bullock Men and Batty Boys, Hidden Men in Toronto and Halifax's Black Communities, which examine the lives of Black men who have sex with men living in 2 Canadian cities. His research interests include Black LGBTQ incarcerated reentry, gender, and Caribbean masculinities. So, over to you, Wesley.
Thank you so much for that introduction. And as always, introductions are much more glamoring than you are. Yes, I was very excited to take the invitation, and I want to congratulate UE Press, the authors, the editors, and those who contributed in terms of reviewing the text. What I liked about the invitation is that I saw it very much as bringing me back home, because being out here now for over 30 years, I couldn't help but say yes to this invitation. I was so excited to be a part of it. And before I get into the questions, I just going to say a couple words before I get there. So I think what is nice about the text is this whole notion of this study of how we look at beyond homophobia. I really like the title as a way of how we can start to imagine possibilities of love, how we can look at understanding this in a way that is a project of many possibilities. And what's incredible about it also too is that it cuts across borders because of the diaspora. So many of us have left the Caribbean and are living out here and can connect with the text. I also teach a course in which I have been using Caribbean literature to really focus on this material. But because of COVID this year, my course was cut because we didn't put it online. So I was looking forward to using this text. So I'm very excited about all of that. It's a glamorous, it is not a glamorous thing per se to always put yourselves up for vulnerability, but there's a very human piece about that. And I think what is nice about this is how we begin to look at how our humanness and humanity comes out in this work. And I really want to congratulate everyone on this. So this is, for me, an incredible moment to share with you. And again, I want to thank you. That being said, like to start with a brief question to the panelists, Carla, Thomas, Colin, Carol, and others. I hope I didn't leave anyone out. How is the volume relevant? And I'd like to put this out to the panelists. Anyone can start with answering. Anna.
Did you just invite me, Wesley?
No, I say anyone can start, but I saw your name first, so it showed up, so I can start.
and it comes first, usually.
Yeah, okay.
So exciting to be here. For me, what's really exciting about the volume as a theologian and an ethicist, coming from a Christian perspective, is that oftentimes the Christian/religious reflections on the LGBTQ experience is so negative, it's so problematic, it's so divisive. So to find ourselves in a space such as which the symposium and the conference allowed, and then to have a volume such as this where what we're sharing are experiences that show that there are spaces where the LGBTQ experience is not just simply about homophobia or negativity, but even in the religious space, there are spaces where there's actually fluidity that's there, where there's actually positive role models to be found, where even in the religious tradition itself, there is so much that can be found that supports queerness. And that's exciting for me.
Excellent. Anyone else?
Yeah, love to add. So as everyone has been saying, I'm really happy to be here, and that, you know, we've like really pushed this to the point where it's a book now. It started out as a concept and now it's a book. I think that this volume is relevant because, and I made notes because I'm like, Carla, don't get off topic. This volume is relevant because it's old and new at the same time, right? It's new because we don't have a lot of edited collections like this surrounding queerness in the Caribbean. Like Thomas, I know your edited collection is one of the few that we have. So it's new in that way, but it's old in that I think what we're doing here is decolonial work. What we're doing here is work to center ourselves inside of our definitions of human. Like we have a long history of white Northern people centering themselves in our ideas of what it means to be human, what it means to be man. And I think that has happened inside of queerness as well, where our idea of queerness is very much bound up in like this white North American, you know, upper middle class gay man, like that is the person who is rightly queer. And for a long time, what we spent our time doing when we engage the Caribbean is asking, oh, how close are we to that? How close are we to that? Like, and actually the question we've asked ourselves time and time again is how much are we failing? How much are we failing to be properly queer? And I think Beyond Homophobia actually starts to ask us a different set of questions, which is what do we do? What have we been doing since time? What are the things that we have to teach the world about being queer? How is it that we have a type of queerness that actually exists before the conception of an LGBT movement at the level of practice? And if we look at that, you know, what can we root into and ground into? And so for me, it's a re-articulation of queerness inside of a Caribbean experience with a lens that doesn't treat us as already failed. It's, for me, this volume is a reclamation, and I think that's why it's relevant.
Yes, thank you so much. I really like the idea of how you talked about reframing queerness from a decolonial perspective. I think that is so critical in the work we do because of how the Caribbean is framed. And I think I'll come back to that question later. What do we mean by that? So I would take note of that. Andrew?
I think, hi everyone, it's so great to be here. It's really incredible to believe that, you know, 5 years later, here we are. But I think definitely this publication is relevant, just to pick up on some of what Carla was saying, because of its diversity. It has a diverse range of opinions. It's very nuanced. It's challenging this idea of a monolithic single narrative and story. And I think regardless of where you lie along that spectrum of perspective, that's so important now, precisely because we are seeing in the world this kind of retreat or desire for a monolithic idea of identity, and this return, this inward, insular kind of conservative, bigoted kind of wave seems to be sweeping through global politics, you know. So I think whilst a long time, a lot has changed since 2015. I mean, like, I don't think any of us would have anticipated actually, you know, what was about to happen, you know, and it's a different world now. I still think that just the fact that we are having this discussion, just the fact that we are all raising our voices, that is definitely pertinent.
Yes, thank you so much. Colin?
Hi, everyone, and thrilled to be here as well. I came to the conference as an activist, and as an activist who struggles to find tools and analysis to ground genuinely Caribbean work. And both the conference and this book, what they both do is further the dialogue between activist practice and political thought and scholarship in about the queer Caribbean. And that every step that we can take to make that happen more can enrich the authenticity and the impact of Caribbean social justice movements.
Yes. Thank you, Colin. Thomas, do you want to continue, take off from there?
Sure. Hi, everyone. It's lovely to be here this afternoon. And I would just really echo what everyone else has been saying and just add that, particularly what Colin just said about speaking between activists and artists, practitioners, etc., scholars. But also, I think that for me, the most important thing about the conference, but also about the books that came from it, was the book the books that will come from it, and this book in particular, and this moment that we're doing right now, is the speaking between ourselves, right? To each other, across islands, across the archipelago, across spans of time and space. And I think that particularly in the 21st century, two of the issues that we will be, I think, asked to talk about with each other that really threaten the Caribbean, well, one of them threatens the Caribbean very, very, very seriously right now, is climate change. So we're in this era when our voices as queer people will be added to this global dialogue, but also thinking about immigration and the ways in which it was just touched upon. Someone, I think Andre just touched on this, the importance of immigration, but also the ways in which immigration, particularly of Black and brown people, and sometimes yellow people, has been so demonized in this era. And immigration has always been a very important part, as we know, of our histories between countries in the Caribbean and elsewhere, right? So I think it's really important that we're talking to each other. And that was, for me, as I said at the beginning, always the most important thing.
Okay, thank you. Mochi, did you want to add anything? Moji? No, okay. Okay, I want to come back to the point raised earlier by Carla around and the whole idea of trying to construct a decolonial queerness. I really think that is so important because in the work of Thomas's and other queer theorists who have done this work in the Caribbean and those of us in the diaspora. And tell us some more. How do you envision that happening from projects like this, in the work you do, the activism, the practices, and in particular, how do we center our work so it is not juxtaposed to that of whiteness? Anyone? Anna, we'll start with you again then.
I guess part of what needs to happen is to ensure that we are speaking in our own voices. And that's part of the importance of a process such as the symposium and the conference, and certainly engaging together in this book, but that we need to speak for ourselves. So the book made clear, for example, that we must not allow ourselves to be framed as victims.
Yes.
That we're always the ones that are in need of help by the very ones outside that Carla has framed and shaped for us for what queerness means. So that's the standard, and then we're measuring ourselves up against that. Part of really fascinating is hearing the different voices and the way those voices have claimed their space. So Carla, I'll point to you again for a second. The work that you did in your chapter with dancehall, which appears to be such an unrelentingly negative space. But then Carla does this fascinating thing, which makes sense to me because, I keep asking, hold on, isn't this queerness going on in the dance hall? How are we not seeing it? Carla said, yes, it's there, and it's actually quite subversively there. And in fact, not only is it subversive, and this is part of what really made me think to Carla reading your piece, that it's actually a necessity to the nature of the dancehall space. So what this book, what this process is calling us to, is to have this kind of interaction that allows our own voices to be heard, that allows us not to be constantly looking outside of ourselves to measure up against others, because the world is a space of diversity. And what we need to do is to claim the diversity of the queerness that's in the Caribbean space.
Excellent. Carla?
Yeah, no, thank you for that. And I agree 100%. It's about learning to use our own language and being comfortable with it. It's one of the things that, for example, Nikolai talks about in the article, which is, reclaiming a term like bulla. Like you're self-identifying as a bulla and moving on with your life. And, oh, you're calling me a bulla man. Oh, I'm hurt. I'm so hurt. Using our own language. And I think one of the things that the Colonial Project was really good at doing, it was teaching us to kind of segment ourselves. So the academic, you take your humanity out of when you're doing your academics. Your personal and your professional are very separate. And I think like decolonizing that is actually trying to reintegrate all of that. So if we are functioning fully as ourselves, and if we're functioning in a way that makes sense for us, You know, what does research look like? What do I define as the field? How do I engage with the people that I am doing research with? Can I remove this idea that I'm automatically harmful to them just by virtue of being there? And then the other thing is like a much broader understanding of queerness, right? Because we've been queer. We're Black queer. We're queer because we're Black. You know, some people are queer because they're poor. Other people are queer because you're a woman, and being a woman in and of itself is a very queer experience, right? So what is our understanding of queerness, and how we have always been a complicated region. We have always been complicated, and we have tried to simplify ourselves, or we have been shamed because we are not simple enough. But I think if we center our type of queerness and we take it seriously, which is that decolonizing work, then a lot more articulation happens, and then we start to take our complexity seriously. And that is what I'm thinking about when I think about like a decolonial LGBT future. It's a world where we take ourselves seriously, and we are constantly interrogating ourselves from this perspective of what can I show, what can I teach, what do I have to offer, what is the thing that I am doing that has never been done and is not being done anywhere else. We actually believe in ourselves.
Excellent. Andrea?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the discussions that we had in 2015, and that, you know, I think I constantly have, it's kind of touched on by Keith McNeil's contribution in this anthology, where this idea of, it's not just this idea of, I mean, there are different sides to the narrative of colonialism in this. It's not, in a sense, what McNeil kind of playfully hints at is that homophobia is itself the colonial import, you know? Very often in this, within our engagement and discussion and, you know, this activism that we have to do, the work that we're doing in the region, we get this pushback where people are saying, well, why are you imposing this foreign lifestyle, you know, being gay, that's a foreign thing. And that in itself reflects not only a dramatic ignorance of the fact that we're already here, and that we are, you know, there are so many parts of our indigenous culture that is inherently queer, but it kind of perpetuates that colonial agenda that we saw with the homophobic laws, for instance, that were promulgated under British Empire, that basically policed desire, you know, under this system in which we were just bodies, we were just meant to be chattels, you know, just laborers. We didn't have any other, there was nothing else going on with us, you know. And I think that too is an aspect of fighting this colonialism, you know, because that has been such a powerful, and it remains a pervasive part of the equation.
Thank you so much. Colin, you have been an activist, and I've known your work and hear your voice quite a bit on this issue, and in particular with someone who has moved forward and backward. I'd really love to hear your Tom's takes on this after.
Well, you know, I've talked for years now about this idea of decolonizing sexual citizenship. And in activist practice, in organizing and political work that we're doing across the Caribbean, we face the same kinds of challenges that we're talking about how do we move to this decolonial notion of queerness that isn't founded on the notion that the region is superlatively homophobic and irredeemable, and that we need to be rescued, and that we need to leave or die. And that's as critical to the work of social transformation that's happening at the grassroots in queer movements across the region, queer political movements, queer movements for change, as it is in the academy, and bringing the two together in terms of fueling that kind of thought and making sure that the kinds of work that are happening in the academy become accessible and relevant to people who are doing social justice organizing work in nonprofit organizations in the region. The book will play a useful role to the extent that we get it into the hands of organizers, and that we create workshops around it as well, so that we can begin translating these ideas around decolonization into the actual choices that we make around or practical politics on the ground.
Thank you, Colin. Thomas? Can't hear you. You're muted.
You're muted.
Thank you. So yeah, sorry about that. I dropped out. Some weird Wi-Fi thing happened. Wesley, what was the question, please?
Oh no, it's the one. My apologies. Carla mentioned in her introduction the whole idea of trying to create a decolonial, I guess, Caribbean queer theoretical framework. And so my question is, what does this mean to you in terms of how do you frame this in the work you do? And in particular, you working in the US and Caribbean and navigating these spaces. What are some of the political dissidences in your life in particular that you bring to this?
Thank you. I think that in particular in the piece that I contributed to the book, that was actually an exploration of some of my ancestry in Jamaica, going back to the 19th century and going back to the 18th century in this country where I'm sitting now in England, and the ways in which slavery and the slave trade across the Atlantic and the triangle, if you will, of the slave trade informed that practice informed my reality, my very skin color, and my presence, my social class in Jamaica, everything, my surname, right down to that. That's why I included photographs with the essay. And the very terrain, the very land, the very soil, the very earth that my Black ancestors worked as slaves and afterward in the post-slavery period. So I think that that essay was something that made me think about the connections between going back, say, 250 years, if you will, and coming then to the 21st century in my own life as a man considered brown in Jamaica and part of the brown middle class and Black in many other parts of the world, right? And how to connect my sexuality to that, which was a question I haven't really entirely answered because the questions of race and also the woman involved in my ancestry in this essay, Catherine, my great-great-grandmother, whose grave we never found in that churchyard in central Jamaica, remains very much a pivotal person, a pivotal question mark as well, just about who is visible and who is not, and who is named and who is not in history. So for me, just certainly in terms of fiction, this was a nonfiction work, but in terms of fiction, I've been very interested in looking at the kind of queerness in pre-20th century Jamaica and in the Caribbean, right? Through this kind of imaginative lens, if you will, but then thinking about how all of this reality informs my very existence today as the queer homo man I am. And I think that just to say, Wesley, really quickly, you know, the central question that I was exploring about where is this grave of my Black great-great-grandmother, whom we finally found out actually was Black, not brown, and had been a leased slave at age 16. It's a really powerful question because, as I said, it ends and maybe in the very color of my skin, which is one of the reasons why I put my hands on my great-great-grandfather's gravestone. I don't know if that speaks to your question. It's just my particular interest at this moment in thinking about Jamaica and what we're saying. You said decolonial practice.
Well, I think we can look at this text also as producing, and for lack of an expression, a sort of a decolonial disciplinary field in queer studies for the Caribbean, and to begin to imagine that, right? But one of the other things that comes to my mind as I read the text is, was there any comparative work done in the Anglo-Caribbean or even Spanish, French-speaking Caribbean to help us understand the different colonial histories and what are the commonalities with those colonial histories at the same time that continues to shape our lives? Colin, want to start with you?
Say that again.
What has there been any work done to compare experiences of non-Anglo-Caribbean countries or even other Caribbean countries such as French-speaking or Spanish-speaking Caribbean islands, and how those different colonial histories shapes this work that we are doing or complements this work?
A little bit, I think not enough. I mean, language continues to be a critical barrier, particularly at the activist level, in terms of how we understand each other's realities. There have been several attempts at organizing across the region, but they've always suffered from the language barrier, particularly, we in the quote unquote English speaking or Commonwealth Caribbean, because we really don't speak English as our first language. Don't learn to speak.
It is English. It is English.
English we're talking.
Don't learn to speak to other people who don't speak what we speak. So, those have been, at least, from the activist perspective, some of the barriers. But I think we've worked around them in terms of entering some political spaces, like the Organization of American States, where there's been a concerted effort at hemispheric engagement around the General Assembly and other civil society spaces.
Oh, thank you. Thomas? I'm going to go reverse this time. Giving Anna a break. I'm going back this way now. Thomas? Thomas, you're muted.
He's muted.
Okay, we'll come back to Thomas. Andrea?
I think just to pick up on what Colin was saying, I agree that the language barrier is an issue, and we were just talking about how we're all islands, so divided, But last week, I think it was last week, I was talking to this Puerto Rican poet and activist Beatriz Yanin Figuera, at the University of Puerto Rico, and she, a lot of that discussion was about this. There's a similar movement there for reckoning with the relics of colonialism, as not just as a European-wide kind of historical thing that happened, and we saw a lot of activism, and we're seeing a lot of activism in Puerto Rico now in the wake of things like Ricky Renuncia, where that governor had to resign because of his, I think he made some homophobic remarks in the Telegraph or something. And yeah, so there is this kind of a general sense of a reckoning, but I'm not too sure of how carefully or how much, study, cross island study has been happening in that regard. But certainly there are similarities in our colonial experiences, and that in itself, I think, goes back to that question of, diversity. We are different. We have different perspectives and opinions. Thomas was just talking about Black versus brown and how that sometimes is dissolved depending on which space you're in. There are differences, but at the same time, throughout the region, and maybe perhaps in the wider queer diaspora, if I could say so, there are similarities too of experiences where there's this engagement or this challenge being brought against hegemonic heteronormative power, So yeah, that would be something I would like to see a lot more of too.
Okay. Next, so a text that you would be working on in the future, research for the future. It's a project. Wow. Okay, excellent.
Okay, taking notes.
Take notes. Carlo?
I'm on the same place where I think that there's more that could be done. I know that there's this Caribbean Women and Sexual Diversity Conference that happens every year. It's hosted in different Caribbean islands. I know that there tends to be, a little bit of integration of people from outside of the English-speaking Caribbean, but I think that is also dependent on if the funding allows, for translators and stuff like that to be a part of it. And when they have the conference, they do tend to do a little bit of research. Usually somebody will capture some data, so you might have something at that level. But there's definitely more. There's definitely more that's needed. But I feel like colonialism is as colonialism does. I mean, it's gonna have shades to it, but it's the same Babylon.
Yeah, no one colonizes innocently.
Exactly.
Anna?
Yeah, I certainly agree with the colleagues that have spoken that perhaps enough is not being done. Perhaps we continue to allow the artificial barriers of language and and politics and so on to divide us when there may be more that unites us across language barriers, where we may believe ourselves to be in a post-colonial space where we have some kind of independence, but there's still a colonial hegemony that is shaping how queerness is negotiated. It continues to have a certain kind of power. So, immediately I think of how we in the Caribbean, the Anglophone Caribbean, negotiate identity. So we will negotiate identity and remain as we are without needing a political statement of being out and so on. And that's part of how we negotiate our identity vis-a-vis what may be other spaces that are more directly and more sort of under the thumb of particular other spaces that have defined queerness in a particular way, defined, gayness in a particular way, that expects that these are particular acts that need to happen. I think we need to continue to bring those experiences into significant dialogue so that, again, we can assert what is particular to us and what we have to contribute, and then at the same time have the interaction and the learning, which is not about being imposed on from outside. So,
if I could jump back in, I think it starts with our own agency at archiving, at bringing these thoughts and these ideas together in places that people can find them. And certainly that's the work that UE Press is helping us to do here. But it's also the work that other folks have been doing, the Caribbean Sexualities portal that IGDS and queer organizations in Trinidad and Tobago have created. And as you know, later this month, the Gay Freedom Movement archives are going to be launched, and that's an incredible trove of of a place where people can look at the history and engage in scholarship around the history of queer movements in the region.
Excellent point, Colin. So it's a form of disciplinary decadence, for lack of an expression, where you sort of bring these different disciplines together and work on translation, archiving, and all those different things, and making it accessible, because I think one of the challenges will be accessibility. And we also run the risk of making it not accessible if it remains an academic discourse. And I think this is where I really like the challenges that you ground the work in and remind the work that it has to be grounded in. Thomas, is there anything you wanted to add to this?
Sure, yes, thanks, Wesley. I think that one of the issues I'm always really aware of is also expense in terms of moving throughout the Caribbean. In 2016, I took a research trip funded by my university to French Guyana and Suriname and Martinique and Guadeloupe and Dominica and Curacao, right? And I expressly wanted to learn more about the Dutch Caribbean, which had been marginalized in my anthology, Our Caribbean, and also about the French Caribbean and the Creolophone Caribbean, and particularly about the role of French Guyana. And what I found in Suriname was really fascinating was that we're talking about queerness and identity, et cetera, but there's a whole other wealth of cultures in Suriname of people who live in the rainforest, not only Amerindians, but also Maroons, who manifest queerness in a completely different way than I had ever thought about it. I'll speak for myself, right? And at the same time, I thought about the importance of people's passports and which currency they use, right? So people in Puerto Rico use the US dollar, people in Martinique and French Guyana and Guadeloupe use the euro, people in Curacao use the Dutch guilder. And all of these individuals these different people in these different places have access to these colonial situations, the metropoles, through their passports, through their citizenship, right? And so I have the privilege of being able to make this kind of trip, but just for our conferences, just in terms of academics and writers, et cetera, whom are privileged people, right? By virtue of what we have access to, we can undertake these journeys sometimes, but I think again about the people of the everyday who can't necessarily do that. And in queer organizing, and maybe in the digital era, and even that is still layered with access and privilege, et cetera. So apart from the language difficulties that we have, and then we have Saran and Tongo in Suriname as well as Dutch, right? How do we look forward to a future in which we are working through these these challenges and getting to these goals of really more, like integrating more with each other, right? Because the cultures are so powerfully different. I was really aware, I had even ignorantly assumed that there would be a great deal of similarity between even the Dutch I heard in Curacao and the Dutch that I heard in Suriname, and completely different nuances.
One of the things I can't help but ask the entire panel is COVID. How we are talking about access, and we're talking about all these issues that impact our work. I don't want to talk too much about my experience in Canada, but we know that race impacts COVID. It's something called social determinants of health, that it really, really has shown us how racism is so endemic in terms of how racialized folks have been exposed to more severely to the COVID pandemic. What has COVID taught you in the Caribbean? Now that you have, this work is out, it came out pre-COVID, but is there something you see in this work as a follow-up to help address those issues within the context of queer organizing? And what challenges you see? And it's open to anyone.
I'll go. So when I look at COVID in the Caribbean and what it's taught me, I think, I mean, we know that COVID exacerbates existing inequalities, but, you know, as I was preparing for this and I was, you know, reading over the section to get prepared for it, and I'm looking at that section that is on teacher education and how for a lot of people who are being trained as teachers, they see that intolerance is actually acceptable, like they see it as an acceptable way to treat LGBT students, or will tolerate you but not accept you. And then I think about how precarious life is for the LGBT community as a result of things like not being able to finish school, right? And how many LGBT people are at a point right now where the organizations have to be doing care packages because a number of people have lost work, or, you know, people are now more vulnerable because they're locked in with family members who aren't affirming, or they're locked in with family members who are, you know, straight up violent to them. So when I think about this volume and I think about what LGBT futures look like, I think about things like that. What is the role of the teacher? What are the conversations that we are having around the safety of our children as a means of having a conversation around the safety of LGBT people? I think what COVID has done is it's kind of been a great equalizer in a way. You know, everybody doesn't experience it in the same, but people who experience social inequality, their experiences during COVID are, you know, they're kind of parallel. And for me, it reminds me that while LGBT people are treated exceptionally, in fact, they are excluded from society, LGBT people are not exceptional in that they're just oppressed people in their communities, and they will experience the things that other oppressed people do. And so if it is that we want to fix something, then sometimes we actually need to cast the net a little wider to catch more people. And, you know, because we tend to be very targeted in the response that we want to have to things that, oh yeah, we need to look at LGBT liberation, or we need to look at LGBT rights, which, yes, but these are actually basic human rights issues. These are issues around poverty. These are issues around gender inequality. These are issues around race. And for me, what COVID has taught me is that poverty eradication has to be the #1 priority for all of our countries. Like, you cannot talk about LGBT liberation. You cannot talk about gender equality. You cannot talk about anti-racist work without talking about poverty eradication, because poverty exacerbates everything. And if COVID has taught me anything, it's that when you're broke, it's worse, honey. And so whether you're broke and gay, broke and straight, broke and trans, if you're broke, it's awful. So we need to get to the bottom of that.
Yeah. As Baldwin reminds us, poverty has no principles, right?
I agree with Carla, you know, Wesley, but is it possible though to say that there is something qualitatively distinctive about being broke and gay? Here's what's sort of going in my mind, and the agreement that I have with you is around how the pandemic has exacerbated. You know, the fault lines already exist in our Caribbean, Jamaican space, and what COVID has done, it says, hey, look, these are there, pretend like you don't see them, but they're there, and then at the same time deepen them. Part of my reflection is a similar reflection to the sense that we think about people who are informally employed, who don't have the kind of safety nets that many of us do.
Yeah.
And they're lacking those safety nets means that they don't even have someone in the family that they can go to borrow some money from. So I translate that across to my concern with what happens with LGBTQ people. Would a similar thing not be their circumstance? So somebody who is not genderqueer may be okay because they can go and borrow, but the genderqueer person may actually be doubly rejected because of genderqueerness. That's the kind of slight point that I just want to press a little bit about what my colleagues think.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's an important point that, being queer makes you broke in a lot of ways, and you were broke as a result of being queer and those structural areas of discrimination before COVID came along. But it's important not to lose sight of the fact that queer communities also have some assets, and some of those assets may be valuable, and we brought those assets to how extended families operate, and to different kinds of leadership, to spiritual leadership, for example. And it's important not just to focus on the deficits. We should have learned all these lessons. I don't know that we are going to. I don't know that state decision makers are actually going to. And, I see Adwa on the call, and I want to sort of shout out the piece that's in the volume that talks about, even in queer communities, who leads? Is it poor and working class people whose agendas and primary concerns become the movement's agenda? And so we've been struggling with even that prior to COVID. So it's an extraordinarily layered thing.
Yes.
And I think just coming from my perspective as a poet and a writer, I mean, as opposed to maybe an academic or even a full-fledged activist, I think the economic crisis that COVID has, first of all, it's an existential crisis in the first place, this deadly disease. But the economic crisis that it has brought upon individual states is a global kind of thing. And that has really, really not only exposed simmering social and cultural problems and things that we need to reckon with, but it has pushed to the fore a kind of a scary period of uncertainty, where I think, it's just kind of hard to come to grips now with, well, what is our future going to look like, because of this disease. And it is economic, yes, because obviously people who are already in a vulnerable position will be the first casualties, when governments no longer are able to fund their budgets. Where's the cut? Where the cut's going to come? It's going to come in the grants. It's going to come in the assistance to the art organizations. It's going to. So I think, though, from this perspective of queer lives and queer futures, COVID has really kind of thrown it's opened a kind of a Pandora's box, actually. That's very scary. And we're looking at, just look at the turbulence in the American political system right now, and all of its strange interrelated insinuations with what's going to happen with their Supreme Court, what's the outcome of this process of transition, and there's a symbolic impact to that as well, as the world watches, and that has a very tangible effect, I think, on my lived experience, going forward, in terms of changing attitudes, changing viewpoints, when millions of people can rally behind someone who has been so, repugnant in his handling of trans rights, for instance, I mean, that to me has a very intimidating, chill effect. And it raises the stakes when it comes to things like this, when it comes to writing, when it comes to activism. It's almost as though you get the sense that COVID and a lot of the things that have happened in this period since the pandemic began, within this period, suddenly activism has become a dirty word almost. Suddenly suddenly we have people calling for law and order and sending in the army for people protesting in the streets who are just standing up for human rights, you know, and that is the dangerous future I think we face.
Okay. Thank you so much, Andrea. Thomas?
Thank you, Wesley. I think that in terms of the Caribbean and COVID, I've thought about two things. Number one, certainly the supreme vulnerability of elderly people,
Yes.
right? And also the frequent isolation of elderly people. But I've also thought about the ways in which, as you all know, many scientific theories that look actually quite sound now abound about the possible origins of COVID by way of environmental degradation, right? Environmental degradation being a highly important issue in the Caribbean. Jamaica, for example, being one of the countries in the world with the most environmental destruction, right? Esther Figueroa, who was at the 2017 conference, has talked a lot about this in her films and her public talks, right? So what happens when you have a future that is on this planet that includes Caribbean LGBTQ, if you will, right? Futures, which is the entire human future, right? Across the spectrum, which is going to be powerfully impacted by future pandemics, because COVID will not be the only one. And as we continue on this planet to go across environments and destroy them and invade them, we expose ourselves to more pathogens about which we didn't know previously. And we also put other creatures at risk as well. So this is the way in which like LGBTQ future presence ties into, as it always would anyway, the entire planet. We're never single issue people, right? I think that this is going to be a very interesting kind of journey and discussion and venture into the scientific environmental realities of our contribution, like how do we contribute to all of this, but how are we impacted by it? We just had a couple of years ago, Zika, right? Which also, by the way, came out of our forays into places in rainforests, for example. It's believed in the far eastern Caribbean and Southern Caribbean, where some environment was destroyed. Some of this also, this speculation about Brazil and its rainforests contributing to, because of the destruction of the rainforest, etc. Right? So we don't talk very frequently about environment and queerness, right? And this planet and queerness in this sense, but I think that this pandemic is showing us, particularly with very vulnerable land masses that are limited, that are also dealing with the priority of food production and tourist space and space allocated to tourism, but the ways in which that tourism destroys the country, destroys the land, and also impoverishes people, the vast majority of people, right? So how do we sort of reckon with all of these questions as we go forward in a time when we are, as I said before, we're going to see more pandemics. And let's also not forget HIV and AIDS, which was also a pandemic. So Zika, according, I don't know how to pronounce it, but according to scientific definitions, it was not a pandemic, it was an epidemic because it was very regional. But nonetheless, it wreaked havoc in the Caribbean, right? It just went right across the Caribbean.
And a couple of points come to my head as you all were talking there is the question of seniors or older queer folks in the Caribbean. Not as a critique of your work, but as we do this work, how do we imagine a space and a place for aging seniors who are queer in this work that we do? And how do we see this work accessing those lives with possibilities that they can still celebrate their queerness as they age? I'll start with Andre.
Yes, anyway, I'd just like to say I'm a senior as well. No.
Sorry.
But I mean, exactly. I mean, age is a number, and I think I know from my own experiences that one of the things I've found is when I speak to younger people growing up now is how different they are from me and from my, so how much progress actually has occurred, because it's remarkable, some of the things that I, in my school days I might have been bashful about, it's now, that's gone out of the window, and that to me speaks volume volumes about the work of people like Colin and the people of everyone here in terms of pushing and being activists. So I think actually it's good to ask this question and to ask, you know, how inclusive we are in terms of having that, going back again to that idea of a nuanced story and a nuanced narrative, because all of our experiences are different, you know. But I can only hope that you know, the more change happens and the more progress is made, it's something that's going to allow and empower everyone, no matter what age they are, you know, and it is something that's going to allow all ages to feel like they can be a part of this shift or contribute to making the region as a whole a safer space.
Thank you, Andrew.
Anna?
Yeah, Anna, yeah.
Well, certainly, when we're talking about seniors, we're probably talking about, and this is me going on with my bailiwick and my area of interest too, that which we're probably talking about people who may be closer to a kind of institutionalized religion that was pretty problematic in terms of how it functioned with queerness, not recognizing that religion, even the newer religion that have been crafted in this space, went along a sort of queer journey. I think Lyndon did a really brilliant job exposing that to us, that, you know, there are these very queer friendly spaces within those kind of new world religions that we don't sufficiently take account of. So thinking about the religious space and seniors, I could see where there is more of that closeness to a way of being religious that's actually rather sort of divisive.
Yes.
But as the work has been done, and Andre and others, you know, as critical as they are of the religious/spiritual space, and they ought to be, because there are so many of those spaces that are not hospitable, even though sort of, you know, ironically, hospitality is supposed to be the hallmark of a space such as that, you know. So where I also see change and growth and improvement is the fact that explorations into religiosity, both inside and outside of the Caribbean, have started to open up dimensions that show that spirituality, sexuality, intimacy, all of those things come together, and that the religious spaces can offer opportunities for those kinds of conversations, and they're not as closed off as we would have thought or would have been the experience of some of the seniors. There's a lot of growth happening.
Okay, thank you so much. Colin?
I mean, we have really weak formal social security systems in the Caribbean. We're pretty young states, and we've just not yet developed a strength or infrastructure for people who are aging. I mean, I'm not sure I'm not sure what your age is, Andre, but, you know, I'll be 60 next year. And it's something I struggle with on a deeply personal level. I think it relates to childlessness. The precarity that I face in aging, I share with other people who are either childless or have invested in children who don't return those investments. We often see the cycle of teenage pregnancy in certain poor communities where traditionally, what's supposed to happen is you invest in your children who take care of you when you get old. And that's being interrupted in certain poor communities where those investments are not building social capital over time. I don't know what the solutions are, but I know that the solutions are not specific to LGBT people, that there's a certain commonality that childless people who are aging face in terms of a shared precarity.
And I just got a note that we have to wrap up soon. But before doing so, I want to say two things. I wanted to give each of you a moment to speak to your piece and to say something about somebody's piece in the text at the same time, or pieces, so that the audience can get a great sense of what's happening here. And I know we are running short of time. This is not unusual. And I'll start with Carla. Talk about your piece and what you see this contributing, and we have 10 minutes for this wrap up. So my apologies.
Okay, so my piece is actually a piece that's co-authored, and what we're looking at methodology and how it is that the whole section is on praxis. And so what I think the section, and I'll give you briefly the takeaways, we really need to reconsider how it is that we envision research, what we think our relationship is to the people that we are researching, and also how we think research functions, right? Yeah. If you're doing research in a space where you are also known to the community, you are loving and having sex with people who are in the community, research takes on a very different meaning, and I think we need to be comfortable with the complication of it. The other thing that I thought that was very important from that section was the idea that teachers are transformational intellectuals. And I think that shifts our idea of what teachers are supposed to be and actually puts them at the vanguard of the social justice movement, because it's their responsibility to take an interest in the people who are most vulnerable. And then the final thing that I think is like really super important from our section came out already, which is that we need to rethink the idea of homophobia and understand that homophobia, as we have received it, possibly cannot capture the fullness of how we have always been, how common bisexuality is. It can't capture the fullness of the fact that for some people, you don't need to come out of a closet because the closet doesn't exist for you, because it's not an identity-based thing, so you don't need to come out of the closet. So I think, like, for me, when I think about the section that I'm representing, those are the things, because I think LGBT life is actually praxis, or life is a set of practices, of liberatory practices, of practices of coming into being and challenging ways of understanding ourselves. And I think that's probably the most significant thing for my area.
Oh, thank you so much. Thomas.
Thank you. I'm not going to speak about my piece. I've already spoken about it. What I do want to say is I really and truly want to give a big up to Moji Anderson and to Aaron McLeod, because not only did they do the work on this book, and they made this book possible, and then they sent it to UE Press in Jamaica, yes, right? And they held this conference more than once at Mona, but they were also generous, kind editors who really, I feel, certainly in my experience, and I know other people feel this, encouraged us to come together in the conference spaces and also in this book, as this book goes onward. So I really want to recognize them, because their modesty, of course, is going to be always outstanding, but I can't underestimate the amount of work that I can only imagine they put into this book and making it possible for us to be here to talk about this. It's something that I don't want to let go unrecognized. And I know that we all feel very similarly. So just to put that out there.
And I echo your sentiments, Thomas, in terms of an exemplary piece of work that they have done and the continuous contribution to the Caribbean literature. And I don't want to forget saying that myself. So thank you for doing that and reminding us. Colin?
Yeah, my piece talks basically about how activism has suffered from a stunted imagination in the Caribbean, and that's largely due to our failure to decolonize how we think about things. And yeah, I just say it very briefly. It was a part of the opening panel. I do want to plug the book. There is a special discount that I imagine will be mentioned later. You know, acquire the book, visit the Caribbean Sexualities portal, attend the Digital Library of the Caribbean launch of the Gay Freedom Movement Archives on the 20th. Let's continue to have these exchanges that enrich both our thinking and our organizing.
Excellent. Thank you, Colin. And it's nice seeing your face again after so long. And both you and Thomas. Andrea?
Yeah, I mean, my piece, I think, is from the perspective of writing, as a writer of poems and essays, and really coming to terms with that idea of the writer's voice and that idea, I guess, of visibility within creativity almost. You know, but I do feel like when I went back to it recently, it did feel like, wow, that was like, it's like a little time capsule that I had opened. It was like, oh, that's where I was at that point, you know, and it's really, it was really great to also go back to this whole publication and pieces like, I think a piece I would highlight would be the piece by Lyndon Gill, where we were just talking about that, about spiritualities, and Anna, I think, was just mentioning this issue, because I mean, the other day, Pope Francis, he came out with this proposal for same-sex civil unions. And for me personally, it's always been a powerful thing and a part of my own story. I mean, I write about this in my essay collection, The Undiscovered Country. And, because I growing up Catholic, growing up as an altar boy, secretly in love with the altar boy's robes. For me, spirituality, I mean, spirituality, we talk about religion versus rights, and it's not necessarily, it's sometimes the sacred versus rights is a false dichotomy, because I think religion very often co-opts some of the strategies of the erotic. And so there is a kind of permeable kind of fluidity of existence, So that's just one of the great standout pieces for me in this book.
Excellent.
Wow. My piece was looking at Marlon James's first novel,
Yes.
where he does this, what for me was a fascinating comparison between dogmatic hegemonic Christianity, and syphilis, and all the stages by which syphilis destroys the body, destroys the mind. And he makes a comparison between what religion does. And I thought that was really fascinating, because in the midst of all of that, of course, were many characters that were homosexuals who were victims and victimizers, and how all of that gets entangled with the religious. And Marlon makes a very trenchant critique against dogmatic religion, but he doesn't leave us in a space where it seems like religion is just wiped out and there's nothing redeemable about it. In fact, he leaves us at a point where we see an embittered woman, Mary Greenfield, almost becoming like a sort of redemptrix. So that there is that possibility and potential for religion that's not dogmatic, that's not going to destroy the mind, because that's the problem. It's where it's unthinking and people are not able to use their reason, and they're not able to also use their hearts as well, because religion that allows all kinds of harm and suffering and abuse of children. So it's a hard read, but for me a very powerful read. And you would have realized by now that I have particular favorites, both in that queer spirituality, queer art section, Lyndon's piece, which I've sort of spoken to before, and Andre has mentioned. Absolutely love what he has done by exposing the queerness that is in, for example, the New World religion or spiritual Baptist that we oftentimes don't pay any attention to. And he narrows down to Calypso Rose, who, many people who love her work and love her performance know not sufficient about the woman and her queerness and her comfort with in herself, both the sacred and the sensual being there, and that awareness of spiritual Baptist as a faith perspective allows for that. I also love Thomas's piece as well. For me, it was visceral, just engaging with the question that he asked around the sexual engagement between his great-great-great-grandmother and this great-great-grandmother who would have rejected him, both for the color of his skin, but quite possibly too for who he is in loving, same-sex loving, And so just fascinating too what Carla did with exposing the rumors in the dancehall space. Rumors are perhaps a way of a method of doing research. We can do a little pushback on that, but I found that fascinating too, what Carla was doing with that as well.
Excellent. I know there must be other contributors in the on this chat, on this Zoom. Is there any other contributors who would like to add any comments? I mean, I think I can make room for that in the time we have. I imagine you would just let the Zoom controller know and they would let you in to say a few things. I think Lyndon is there. I know Lyndon is there. I don't know who else is there.
Ad was there. Ad was also one of the contributors. I'm seeing her. I'm seeing Valicia. She's also a contributor as well. Carol is there as well, another contributor. So there are quite a few people who may be willing
Yeah, I'd
to.
like to leave this moment for them to make any comments, so that if they would like to.
Anna, because of your piece, today I was down a rabbit hole of
Another brilliant piece by
You
him.
need that book in my teachings.
I've used Drunkard's Devil several times over to teach master's classes in religion and that kind of thing, because it's fascinating and a way of also exposing Jamaican culture and, you know, just our way of doing things. So fascinating.
Okay. No one seems to want to make any comments.
Hi, this is Adwa. So I'm just going to quickly say that thanks to Moji and Erin for providing a platform for us to put our perspectives out there, or diverse perspectives. I haven't yet had the opportunity to read all of the pieces, but I am tremendously proud to be a part of this project, and I look forward to it going out there to the world and for everybody to read it. And I'm definitely looking forward to using it as a teaching tool, particularly in the area of gender and development studies. I think the students will gain a lot from this material. It's needed, and I'm very happy to be a part of it.
Thank you, Adua. Anyone else?
Yes.
Go ahead.
Me?
Excellent. Go ahead.
Hi. Sorry, are you hearing me?
Yes, yes.
Oh, hi. Sorry. Okay, right. So my name is Carol Gentles, and my colleague and I, Velitha, who was also in this session, our chapter looked at the issues of, homophobia in our education sector in Jamaica, specifically teacher education. And we were really delighted to be part of this project because it gave us an opportunity as teacher educators to start, I think, prying open a space in which some of the issues that are very prevalent in our education sector could start to be identified and explored. Because I think the education sector is one of the sector in Jamaica which is still very much closed to open discussion and dialogue about homophobia, and therefore this has allowed us to help start the discussion that will help us to move beyond homophobia in this space. So I think we really appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you so much, Carol. Is there anyone else before I pass it over to Moji? Okay, if there's no one else, I want to say thank you so much.
I think that's O'Neill.
No, O'Neill.
Oh, thank you so much. Go ahead, O'Neill.
Can't hear you, O'Neill.
He's still muted. He's still muted.
No, they just unmuted it. Thanks. No, I too would like to add my thanks to Moji and Erin because they're particularly patient with me working on it, and I'm sure everybody else experienced that as well. I am very happy that in terms of writings on the visual arts are also part of this, because I feel that it is still an area that needs to be properly plumbed, if for one lack of a better word, because it really is also a critical area for queer studies right now, especially within the Caribbean, especially in Jamaica, because there has been a lack of that. I mean, we've been looking on various aspects, but I think the visual arts is, I think there is a institutionalized fear of talking explicitly about what is within the visual arts and the potential that it has for contributing to this dialogue. So I am very happy that my piece was included. I'm looking forward to reading everybody else's when I get my copy. But as I said, this is really more of a commentary and thanks, and based off of the discussion, I'm really looking forward to seeing the full volume. Big up Carla for the section representation.
Yeah.
Am I missing anyone now? Because I can't see who is coming on. Okay. I wanted to say thank you for granting me the opportunity to be in the Caribbean with you, tele work-wise. and to be a part of this launch, this historic moment, and to thank you for asking me to be a part of this larger project. And again, to thank all of you, the panelists, Andrea, Carlo, Anna, and Thomas and Colin. Thank you so much for your contributions. And again, it's nice to connect with you after not seeing some of you for so long. And I want again to thank Erin and Moji for their incredible contribution. We press for ensuring that this work came out and push it. And I hope most of you who are listening out there, who are scholars that teach, will adopt this text and adopt it ongoing, because it contributes to the larger scholarship that exists out there. And so without further ado, I'll pass it now on to Erin and say again, I thank you so much for having me to be a part of this. I feel honored. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Wesley, for your questions.
Thank you so much for connecting with you, Erin. Andrea, nice seeing you, connecting with you also. I've read your work so many times, but never met you before. So thank you so much.
Great, thank you so much to everyone. I just want to say initially, just as co-editor for this project, I really feel privileged to have been involved from the beginning to the end. And before I sort of provide some additional thank yous, I really want to thank all of the panelists and tell everybody who has been listening just how wonderful these people are and where you might find some additional amounts of their work. So Andre Bagoo, who's a Trinidadian poet, he's the author of 4 books of poems, including Pitch Lake, and a forthcoming essay collection entitled The Undiscovered Country. Thomas Glave is professor of English and creative writing at the State University of New York, Binghamton, and his landmark 2008 Our Caribbean, a gathering of lesbian and gay writing from the Antilles, was an inspiration for this book. His most recent book is Among the Blood People, Politics and Flesh. Anna Kasafi Perkins is a senior program officer in the Quality Assurance Unit at the University of the West Indies, Mona, Jamaica, and her publications include Quality in Higher Education in the Caribbean and Justice as Equality, Michael Manley's Caribbean Vision of Justice. Carla Moore lectures at the Institute for Gender and Development Studies at the University of the West Indies, Mona, Jamaica, and you can find her on Twitter and Instagram at MooreTalkJA. Colin Robinson is director of Imagination for CAISO, Sex and Gender Justice. His publications include the poetry collection, You Have Your Father Hardhead, and the co-edited books, Other Countries' Black Gay Voices, and Think Again. So thank you also to Professor Chrislow for kindly chairing this whole affair and everybody who attended the launch of what we see as a landmark publication. In terms of what we are celebrating, we need to thank all of the contributors, the peer reviewers that helped to improve the text by suggesting important revisions, and of course, UE Press for making the decision to publish Beyond Homophobia in the first place. We'd like to give special thanks for the amazing cover image entitled Not Your Slave, which was produced by Carib Funk and Simone Harris, directed by Lee Rose, styled by Amani Edwards and Lee Rose, and photographed by Shasta Lee Smith with her assistant photographer, Chadrick Barnes. The cover design is by Richard Rollins. Thank you to Siobhan Hearn for shepherding the book through production and for all the staff at the press who make books possible, particularly Joseph Powell, Kelly Williams, Karen Smith, and Donna Muirhead. Of course, it is important to thank the many people who assisted in organizing this launch. Zoom launches are not easy, so special thanks to the press's IT team. Thanks again to the chair of UE Press, Dr. Longsworth, and to the press's board members. And of course, to the Institute of Caribbean Studies and JFLAG, who have been our partners in everything beyond homophobia from the beginning, symposium, the 2 conferences through till now, and other partners we've had over the years, UWE's Faculty of Law, the Faculty of Social Sciences, Jamaicans for Justice, the Caribbean Vulnerable Communities Coalition, the Jamaica Association of Diverse Businesses, UNDP, British Council, FIWI Jamaica, Outburst Queer Arts Festival, 360 Artists, Weekly Projects, the Being LGBT in the Caribbean Initiative, and a very special thank you to the senior administration of the University of the West Indies, which has always made the conference and Beyond Homophobia feel completely at home. Finally, we'd like to respond to a question asked during the discussion about making the book more readily available for LGBT youth seeking guidance. That question now has us thinking about how we can provide copies for distribution to libraries and other spaces. So thank you so much for raising this issue. And finally, please don't forget to buy copies of the book. And you can now, because there's a special launch discount of 30% from now until December the 11th, and go to uepress.com for more details. And so all of the best, and thank you again for taking time out of your day to be with us and share the celebration of what I think is such an important and really wonderful, varied book to have been a part of, and most importantly, to read. So thanks so much.
Thank you, Erin. Bye, everyone. Hope to connect with all of you in person.
Yes. Thank you so much.
Bye, everybody. It's Moji.